Hello and welcome to the Databank video for the May issue of The Banker. I'm Kat van Hoof and today we'll be discussing global M&A trends in the first quarter of 2019. With me here today is John West, Managing Editor of Acuris Mergermarket and Dealreporter service. Mergermarket released its data report on global M&A trends in the first quarter recently. I just wanted to talk a bit about how the scene has changed from 2018. The start of that year was a bit different from this year. Can you talk a bit about the data?
Sure, yeah, it's not been a vintage year thus far. In value terms, M&A globally fell 15% in the first quarter of 2019 versus 2018. Now, obviously, there's a degree of regional difference. There was a bright spot. Middle East saw increased activity in value terms. However, if you strip out Aramco Sabic and the Uber Careem deal, it doesn't look so pretty. Asia Pacific activity fell 25%. Europe's really in the doldrums, down 55%. However, the North America, so US and Canada, that only fell 4%. So there's a degree of stability and robustness in that market.
Can you talk a bit about the difference between Europe and why it's done so badly versus the US?
A lot of it comes down to politics, both sides of the pond. In the US, clearly the Trump administration is keen to encourage more Made in America activity. And although cross-border deals have fallen by the wayside for various reasons, antitrust, obviously, we've seen with Alstom Siemens. We saw in 2018 the Qualcomm-Broadcom deal become a victim of the trade war, and various agencies, both in China and the US, kind of played off against each other. But in the US itself, clearly there's a keenness to combine supply chains to kind of fend off against that protectionist wave. And there's administration support for that. In addition to which, of course, the financing environment is crucial. We're in a period where good news is bad news and bad news is bad news. If we have sustained robust economic activity in the US, the Fed will raise rates, which will make obviously financing that little bit more expensive. And bad news, of course, is just bad news. It's 10 years since the last recession, which is the joint longest period between recessions in the US since the war.
One of these very big deals, intra-American deals that we've seen was BB&T and SunTrust, two big regional banks. Can we talk a bit about the difference between bank consolidation in the US and Europe? We see a lot of potential in the US, but Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank died recently. What gives?
Well, again, it comes down in no small part to the political situation. Look, Trump in the States has been very vocal about the fact that he views US banks as having been weighed down by huge bureaucracy. And so there's clearly an attempt by the administration to welcome mergers, and there's no fear about having banks that are too big to fail, or certainly less. Now, that hasn't bled through into legislation. There was a proposal to lessen some of the requirements on banks, but it didn't pass through the Congress. It's unlikely to, now that the Democrats, of course, are back in control of the House. But the mood music from the federal agencies under the executive branch is a lot more accommodative. Meanwhile, in Europe, the politics are somewhat different. Although there's the single supervisory mechanism under the European Central Bank in the Eurozone, nonetheless, there are national regulators and the ECB. That relationship is still being worked out. And in Germany, obviously, Olaf Scholz, the finance minister, who was apparently quite supportive of Commerzbank, Deutsche Bank, came under huge pressure given that the deal would have probably seen 30,000 jobs lost. So the picture is just a lot more mixed in Europe.
I see. But there is one bright spot as well in terms of the private equity market. That's done very well over 2018 and seems to be doing well in 2019. But sort of, as you said, staring down the barrel of potentially a downturn later this year or next year, still enormous, record amounts of dry powder, but still very high equity valuations. How is this looking going forward?
Well, at Mergermarket last year, we undertook a survey of private equity portfolio managers globally, 100 of them, and something like 50%, pretty much exactly 50% of them said that they expected returns in the next 5 years to be at the same level or higher than the previous 5 years. Now, everyone kind of expects a bit of a downturn in the coming year or so. If that's the case, how can that be? One of the things that private equity are really looking at is doubling down on sector specialisation. So look, you've got funds like Permira, Cinven, where just as an example, their healthcare teams are particularly respected. I think we're going to see more of that focus on specific sectors. There's going to be greater, I think, vertical integration of portfolio companies to try to extract further value from those companies. And look, I think as well, we're going to be seeing private equity deploying their capital on smaller situations. We've seen, for example, with Ford, the major motor company, they're using a blockchain technology to track lithium throughout its supply chain. This is an example of a kind of bolt-on technology that can be transformative for a business. And I think that private equity is going to want to be involved in some of those smaller situations and maybe make more of those VC-style investments.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you.